right, so we're back with another KrakCast profile. We're talking about people from the world of Polish arts and high culture. Last time we talked about Frédéric Chopin. And we're back with another profile of someone who's also kind of connected with the piano for reasons we'll get into soon. We could easily talk about this person in a different context of politics as well. Super talented, very, very accomplished. So much so, in fact, that he needed 3 names. Ignacy Jan Paderewski is our subject today.
Usually it's just assassins. Or
let's start with the early part of his. Before we go back to his early days, Josh, maybe you can clear something up for me. Okay, so he's part musician, composer, and later on in his life he became a politician. Let's start with the music first. Was he a performer who also composed, or a composer who performed?
Oh, I think, certainly in terms of legacy, I think by far he was more a performer who composed. There's really not that many of his compositions that have endured beyond kind of, those people who are really kind of concerned about things that are generally forgotten about these days. There's a couple of his pieces that are incredibly famous. There's a Minuet in G, which I think is probably, if you kind of look on his Wikipedia page, so you can even click on it and listen to it, and it is one of those like, oh yeah, that's kind of some piano fireworks and does sound very pretty. But,
one of the first performers to really gain a reputation as a performer, selling tickets and filling concert halls and whatnot. Maybe it was just his timing. I mean, that was the age of people being able to attend concerts, or was there something special about his playing, or what?
Well, yeah, actually, there's a number of things. I mean, there's the timing of when he was alive, really, where he was kind of born, I think maybe like 15 years after Chopin died. Franz Liszt was still alive. There was a kind of overlap there, but he was very much kind of at the forefront of, if you like, the second wave of Romantic era piano players. And by this time, the physical construction of the
Romantics.
Well, yeah, the old Romantics, I suppose. Well, yeah, but the physical construction of grand pianos was massively improved. They were stronger, bigger, and louder than even the pianos from like Beethoven's or Chopin's. I mean, the first steps were being taken in Chopin's time.
So you could hit them harder and be louder.
I mean, they had like cast iron frames, which meant you could have
cast iron. Aren't pianos heavy enough
metal
already? Good God! All right, let's back up for a second, Dave. What strikes you about his early days?
What strikes me about his early days is like Josh was saying, that amazing background he has, where he's grown up and he's guys like Liszt and that are still around, and Strauss, I believe he came across when he moved to Berlin as well. And he seems to have really gone the extra mile with his training. He's done everything he can to be the great prodigy, the great master. Not to pull up our resident musical expert, but I did read that his 75 compositions in many forms were quite well received and quite famous when he was alive. I mean,
well, no, that's true.
Their legacy hasn't survived so much.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I said about enduring, really.
Yeah, okay, because, no, fair enough. So he has a very interesting background. I don't know that much of the detail.
Actually, something popped into my head now when you guys were talking about why he might have been so popular there and why performing all those concerts were such a big deal. I think because this was the time in history, the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, it was easier to go from point A and point B and logistically have a concert happen. In Mozart's time or even Bach, that was a bigger deal. So the chance of somebody famous performing in your local venue was next to nil. But when Paderewski came around, that was already something that could happen, but people still had the mentality that we got to go see this guy because it's so rare, it's so uncommon, and you're not going to pop in a CD.
Also, maybe a more well-developed media could publicize his travels.
Exactly, but that's also part of the whole Industrial Revolution era, where things just began to spread, and first steps of globalization.
Mike makes a very good point. Sorry, but Dave, but Mike makes a very good point there, because in fact, I mean, he was this was a little later on in his career, but he was famous for having his own railway carriage. So, I mean, and of course, as you say, the Industrial Revolution meant that travelling was much easier because you could go by rail, which also meant you could take your ton of cast iron grand piano on the train with you, and it would stay in tune and so on like that. But, yeah. Anyway, do I just keep talking until somebody butts in?
No, keep going as long as you want.
The complicated thing I forgot was this, where he was born. He was born to Polish parents. I'm reading this now. In the village of a very complicated village.
I think it's in present-day Lithuania.
So that was in the Russian Empire. Then it became part of the Polish, or part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for centuries before that. And today it's part of Ukraine.
Well, as with so many people, I mean, from the 19th century, it's really messy because of the politics, because of the moving borders. The kind of mishmash of ethnicities here. You know, they were born in one place, went to school in a different place, prospered professionally in another place, and died in another place. But they never moved geographically. But those are 5 different countries, basically. You know, because of their, because of the timing.
Love that he had his own railway car though, like Zeppelin with the starship.
Yes, right.
He was pimping, yeah.
All right, so he's accomplished musically. Makes a ton of money, and we'll come back to the subject of money a little bit later. Makes a ton of money, very accomplished, and maybe because of his opportunities to move in these, social circles, made possible by his fame and notoriety, he comes in contact with a lot of people from the world of government and politics and whatnot. And this kind of facilitated a fascinating career move, I guess you could call it. Not entirely leaving the piano behind, but kind of moving towards the halls of government.
I'm just going to interrupt briefly there to add to that, because not only was he kind of playing, massive concerts all around Europe, and he was a real superstar, but he was also touring the United States. One of the things which again kind of like facilitated his progress in other spheres was the fact that, as he was going to be repeatedly pointed out, he ended up being fluent in 7 languages, and he was able to kind of converse and meet all kind of types of people.
He's a great raconteur and conversationalist, a man of culture. One of these real Renaissance men that the era seemed to throw up. A figure as outstanding as Nikola Tesla was obsessed with the guy. He just thought he was the most amazing pianist he'd ever seen in his life. A cultural icon of his era, the rock star of his day. We're going to get to his smouldering sex appeal as well on stage. Apparently, he was very popular with the ladies in attendance. But I think John, what Josh is trying to say is a real crucial part of the story is that when he starts touring the United States, he becomes a superstar. I mean, people just
and he gets name recognition that opens a lot of doors later.
He inaugurated the Carnegie Hall, didn't he? Or at least he was the first solo performer to play in that.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Carnegie Hall, yeah.
Okay, big deal. Yeah, fine. So now can we move to politics a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we should talk about a smouldering sex appeal. Right, look,
politics and sex,
not just sex appeal,
when you read
smoldering
about
sex
him, there's
appeal.
a lot of these kind of implied messages that there were other virtuosos just as good as him. It was the fact that he had this charisma, this stage presence. He was the original rock star. Discuss.
Well, yeah, there's that kind of like that terrific kind of quote by Moritz Rosenthal, who upon hearing him play, saying, "He's good, but he's no Paderewski." And actually, that kind of tickled me enough to look up and find out who the hell Moritz Rosenthal was. And it turns out that actually he was he's slightly older, but arguably an even bigger rock star than Paderewski was in his day, and was in fact like Liszt's favoured pupil. So he's virtually totally forgotten about now, Rosenthal. But when he said, made a witty remark like that, that would have carried some weight.
Now can we talk about politics? Okay. Yeah.
Okay. He's a fascinating political figure. We'll give you that as well.
Okay, but there's an interesting transition that's kind of forged in the First World War, right? Mm-hmm. Where
he urges the Polish to fight
exactly
on the Allied side because he knows that this will position them well to finally get Poland back on the map afterwards. And of course, this leads into his legendary leading of the delegation to the Treaty of Versailles.
Well, there's also
and I'd like to invite Mike in at this stage. Sorry, Mike, you jumped the gun. I was just setting you up there, fuck's sake. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, while Paderewski was in the United States during the beginning of during the time when the U.S. joined World War I, which was January 1917, he also spoke with Wilson and made the argument to President Wilson, then Woodrow Wilson, to help support the Polish cause, the Polish national cause, and for a new Poland to be formed. And one of the points of Wilson's 14 points for the treaty after World War I was that Poland should exist as a separate and distinct nation with its own borders. And he also made this argument in front of Congress when, at the beginning of World War I, and this all led up to the fact that Paderewski was allowed to lead the delegation. And when the Treaty of Versailles came around, then, one of the end points there was that Poland would be reformed and reconstructed as a new nation to return to existence on the world stage.
So that's basically the calendar year of 1919, from January to December. He's the first prime minister of a post-war. But this is what, the Second Republic. He's appointed to the office by Pilsudski, Josef Pilsudski, which is a very important figure. Have we ever talked about Pilsudski?
Yes, we have.
Well, maybe not in such detail, but we'll come back to him at some point. He's a military strongman.
We did a whole piece on the Pilsudski-Dmowski divide, that whole era of Polish politics. You never remember any of our pieces.
We did not do that.
So weird.
We did not do that.
We did.
We had an Independence Day special, and we kind of...
Also, it was about Independence Day, not about Pilsudski.
Well, it was about that whole era.
It was kind of
we haven't done a specific Pilsudski episode.
Anyway.
Sorry, listeners.
Anyway, we'll sort that out somehow. Anyway, so he steps down at the end of 1919 as this is the beginning of a really super ultra chaotic period, even by Polish politics standards. He steps aside to return to a life in music, guys, but politics would call him back at some point about a decade later. But in the 1920s, to return to the subject of money, Josh, he made this amazing fortune touring America and Europe as well, among all over the world, really. And he takes his fortune, and it turns out he's incredibly generous with the fortune, endowing scholarships and foundations and trusts.
Yeah, I mean, it seems kind of extraordinary that you could get that rich just from playing the piano to people, because I mean there wasn't records or radio. Well, no, actually, by the 20s they were, but I mean it wasn't like it.
Low enough overheads, Josh. Just the fancy train, the piano, and all the ticket money was.
But I mean, he really did make
35 guys to carry your iron piano.
Enormous amount of money. I mean, he bought this massive, 2,000-acre estate in California. Which he then planted with Zinfandel grapes, and which are still, used today for
one
making
good
the
decision after another.
Californian wine.
He just on the side set up the world's finest vineyard as well. I love this guy.
Oh, by the way, yeah.
On my back garden, I'll just grow the world's finest wine.
When he wasn't kind of springing for the cost of the Grunwald, monument on Platzmateki. And
that's right. Of course, that was earlier. That was the 500th anniversary. It was of 1910, I guess it would have been. Yeah,
big patriotic protest in Krakow. Then, just as it was being unveiled as well, it was a big cultural event.
And we also kind of skimmed across his year in power a little bit there. I mean, everything I read indicated he had a lot of achievements while in office. I mean, he was seen as a very unifying force in Polish politics, which was very much needed because of those Dmowski.
I think he was kind of seen as kind of maybe not non-partisan exactly, but kind of like everybody's friend.
Well, I'm just going to interject because probably at some point we're going to do a thing about the 100 years since the Polish-Soviet War, which is a very kind of interesting topic. But in relation to that, it's been kind of suggested that had Poland decided to back the White Russians rather than the Bolsheviks in 1919, then there would not have been the Bolshevik aggressive attack in 1920 that the Poles were able to so bravely defend. But that's obviously not entirely connected. Except
they created a problem that they could solve themselves to look good.
Yeah.
Some 4D, 5D chess there. Yeah.
Anyway, even though you do it more polite than me, as I was rudely interrupted there, just to list
After
some of the
Josh.
just to list some of the achievements of his government: the first democratic elections, ratification of Versailles, some kind of treaty of protection on ethnic minorities, very progressive, Jan. The outbreak of epidemics, we're fended off. Famine was solved in the country. There were border disputes, that he helped with, and of course the representation at the League of Nations. That's a lot of achievements in 1 year. Pretty impressive stuff. I mean,
what did you do last year?
There's a reason that this period of Polish politics is pretty legendary, because isn't it saying that as things progressed, things got worse? Things got more factional, things got more aggressive in the politics. But this kind of early era is a bit of a golden era in Polish politics, very well remembered, Mike.
I suppose also it was kind of emerging from that kind of, I preempted there, but because, for that time at least, everyone was willing to work together for the common good, and it was only later on that the kind of the different factions, which were really quite polarized, started to emerge.
I think that's quite comparable exactly to what happened here in Poland in '89, when for the first few months, for the first year, all these different opposition factions were able to work together to start up Poland into the modern society it is now. But by the time the second elections came around, or even the presidential ones in the 91, it all just kind of fell apart.
That's a nice parallel, Mike, I must say.
So the Second World War breaks out. and kind of drags Paderewski back into the realm of politics. But this time he kind of uses his maybe connections in America and notoriety in America to try to rally the people there to the support, not just of Poland, but just the cause generally in Europe. He heads something called the National Council of Poland, which is, I think, was an arm of the government in exile in London at that point, the Polish government in exile in London at that point. Of course, America wouldn't get involved in the war until, the spring of 42 in Europe, right?
Or 43 even, wasn't it?
Spring of 42.
I mean, there was the whole land lease and actual industrial support of the Allies.
Boots on the ground somewhere.
Was it like
summer
it was
42?
They were definitely
Sicily.
in North Africa, but then Sicily was probably the first boots on the ground. But that's the same time, basically, that the Brits and the French had boots on the ground. Then
interesting episode from this part of his life when he's in America in 1940, again trying to rally people to the cause of the defense of Poland and fighting the Nazis. It was the 50th anniversary, hard to believe, the 50th anniversary of his first tour of America. And there was an event put on, I think it was called Paderewski Week or Paderewski Month, I'm not sure. Paderewski Week, was it? I think, Paderewski Week. Thousands of events held all over the country, performances of his music. And it was meant to culminate in a performance at Madison Square Garden in New York. And strangely, he refused to go on stage, insisting he had already performed the concert. I guess he was having what we call today a senior moment. Yes, and he was we suspect that he was recalling a concert he put on there like 20 years before.
It's like
Hi, Cleveland.
I did this all.
It's like Spinal Tap. It all starts to seem the same after a while.
Yeah. But well, anyway, so he passes away 42. 41, June of 41.
And before we get to his death, can we just focus a little bit on the National Council of Poland, the government in exile? It's a great bookend to the man's political career to be this iconic leader. That yet again in his late 70s, I think it was, early 80s, stood up for Poland and represented them in the best, the most dignified way possible while the country was being destroyed. He really is a legend, this dude.
He was also in a movie which you can find on the internet. It was called Moonlight Sonata, made in 1937. It's a somewhat flimsy love story that kind of happens while he plays himself and he plays the piano, and you can find it on YouTube. Moonlight Sonata, 1937. Ignacy Jan Paderewski, and he acts.
And that year, he agreed to take his final student, who ended up being Witold Małczyński, who I believe is a bit of a legend as well. He became the next great Polish piano player. So, as well, just before he dies, he leads one more government, trains up the next generation, very responsible, very sustainable. There's another great pianist, and he's right up to the end of his life. He's knocking off the legendary achievements. We have to talk a little bit about his philanthropy as well, John. I mean, very impressive, some of the things he paid for and set up. Didn't we cover that already? All of it?
We mentioned it, yes.
Yeah.
Let's go to his death then. Okay. Pull the trigger.
Well, so he dies in 41, but 6 or 7 years after he dies, the first of several foundations named after him pop up in America and elsewhere. In Chicago, there's one called, it's the Ignacy Jan Paderewski Foundation, kind of promoting Polish culture and cultural events generally and whatnot. Every city in this country, in Poland, has something named after him, whether it's a musical academy, as the one in Poznan is, the usual elementary schools and museums and various culturally related institutions. Dr. Mike, any idea why we have to use three names when we're talking about him, by the way? What's with that?
I think it's one of those things that if, like when you're a rap star, if you just put that name out there and repeat it all the time, it becomes your branding.
Like Michael J. Fox, we have to use the
I think actually there's also a slight element to which that actually his father, Jan, was in his day pretty famous in his own right. So that was kind of part of the reason why he kind of, his first name was Ignacy, and then kind of like sticking the Jan in, which was his middle name, just was a kind of reminder people that this Ignacy Jan Paderewski is in fact the son of the famous Jan Paderewski.
And so he had to mooch off his dad's popularity and fame. That seems kind of reverse.
And of course, he's a big deal in Poland, and his memory is kept alive. But what fascinates me about Paderewski is, as I hope we've, in our kind of own jumbled way, covered most of his achievements there, the guy was one of the most famous men alive when he lived, and outside of Poland, very few people know who he is. Under 50 anyway, I would say. So it's interesting to me why certain people's fame and legacy. Look at all the things he's achieved, and nobody really knows who he is now. It's
and everybody knows Cardi B.
You can't even find a half decent documentary about him on YouTube. Trust me, I looked. There's nothing there,
Dr. Mike, do you think most Polish people, when they hear his name, do you think the first thing they think about is the music or the politics?
I think the music.
Actually, I would think the politics, because usually kids in school, they learn about his involvement in the history books, which is usually more about the political issue. It's like they all know that he was a famous musician because it's just something that pops up in culture, generally speaking. But as a person, I think they relate to him more maybe politically. Though nowadays, with all the trusts and foundations and schools named after music schools, everybody knows he was a musician, a virtuoso of his time as well.
Wasn't there the sense that, as Josh, I think, touched on earlier, he was literally a shorthand for a fucking genius. This kid's a Paderewski on our hand. We got a Paderewski on our hands.
Yeah.
Right up until you were saying, when you were learning the piano, you'd still hear people throw that phrase around.
That's right. It was. Of course, this would be
that was what? You were playing the piano in 18... Oh, no.
Well, no, but my parents' generation, certainly my grandparents' generation, for my grandparents, who were born in 1900, Paderewski would have been, the piano playing superstar of the day, throughout, their early and middle adult life. So, yeah, for sure. It was you kind of talk about someone being the Jimi Hendrix of the guitar, and then, you'd be a Paderewski on the piano.
He sponsored the Washington Arch. I don't remember you mentioning that.
Among the many the tributes and signs of his fame that we could mention, the one stands out to me, and I think to most people it's really interesting. Paderewski has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
No way.
Believe it or not. Hollywood Walk of Fame, it's not just movie stars. There's plenty of people who are accomplished in things like radio and work behind the camera.
Real estate.
And the recording industry and things like that. He has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In fact, a little bit of trivia here. He is one of 3 people on the Hollywood Walk of Fame who were also heads of government. So Paderewski being both a prime minister and an entertainer and musician. I'm not going to ask you guys if you know who the other 2 are, because I know you know who the other 2 are, because we were talking about it before we recorded.
Are you setting us up for a KrakCast competition?
The other 2 are both American presidents. Ronald Reagan got a star on the Walk of Fame because of his acting career.
But you thought Trump didn't have one, so now we're doubting the veracity of this.
I had forgotten that Trump had one. Of course I knew it, but I'd forgotten that Donald Trump had a star on the Walk of Fame because of his TV career, strangely enough.
John's an old quizmaster. To the nearest 100, John, how many stars are there on the Walk of Fame?
But if you were to ask somebody...
No, don't ignore me. How many? I'm asking you. How many? Guess the answer. How many?
It's like 1,500 or 1,700.
Wrong.
How much?
It's 2,500.
Okay, so I was in... When I said 1,700, I'm not...
I was going to say 500. So
I was just going to say, I think I would have won that.
For you.
Anyway,
but you know that you could get your own. It's not, the star isn't given out by committee. It's actually you start your own
you pay for them.
club, and you pay for your commission.
Yes, you do.
Oh my God, Mike, you're even cynical about the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
But if you were to ask,
most sacred institution,
Dr. Mike, if you were to ask most Polish people, can you name what connects Paderewski, Trump, and Reagan? I'm guessing that not one person in 1,000 would know.
Yeah, that's the way you should have phrased that at the start. That would have been good.
That's true. Let's record this whole thing over again.
They might all say, "Oh, they were presidents."
Let's do all this over again. Well, there you go. A few things, a couple of interesting nuggets about their own nuggets, Dave.
He's a great property developer, but he's no Trump.
About Ignacy Jan Paderewski, accomplished composer, pianist, and Prime Minister of Poland, among many, many other things. And what was it? Rancher, wine grower, grape. What do you call somebody who does that?
And cunning
viniculturist, culturalist,
and cunning linguist extraordinaire.
And according to Dave,
ladies' man, and
smoldering sex god,
sexy, charisma-filled performer who filled the stage with his mustache as much as his music.
Can't top that. See you next time on KrakCast Profiles.